And thanks to the SRI. And apologies, I wasn't here at the beginning, but we're discussing actually a lot of the same issues in the finance bill as we speak, and quite a few of us on the committee are kind of double jobbing this evening, but I did read your paper. Yeah, I mean, I do want to ask about the carbon tax and the sort of commitment people seem to have to it, and maybe the failure to distinguish between different types of carbon taxes. So I'm absolutely in favour of carbon taxes on people who are making profit from polluting the environment with CO2s. But I am absolutely not, and I don't actually accept that it changes behaviour if you impose financial penalties on people for using fossil fuels where they have no choice. And I think you have to distinguish between those. So if you say, let's put it on the aviation, the profits of Ryanair and, airlines, if you want to put it on the profits of Larry Goodman and the big beef processors, absolutely, load it on as far as I'm concerned. But if you're going to put it on the small farmer, or you're going to put it on the family living in social housing where the council aren't going to insulate their home for the next decade, and where right as we speak they're having to pump up the heat to an extent that anybody who's well paid doesn't have to, because their home is already well insulated, or they can avail of the grants and make up the difference between the grants and the actual cost of retrofit because they can afford it, and the family who actually couldn't, even if they could get the money, wouldn't be allowed to do it because they're in private rented accommodation or they're in social housing. That person isn't going to change their behaviour because they can't. They're not allowed. They're prohibited at every level from changing their behaviour, but they're being punished in a situation where they're doing nothing wrong. And that's the misapplication of carbon taxes, and I think we have to speak out strongly about it. And the danger is, if we don't challenge those type of carbon taxes, what you will actually do is turn the least well off and the most vulnerable, and by the way, the people who are least guilty of carbon pollution, because there's absolutely no doubt on any study, globally, domestically or anywhere else, the rich emit far more carbon than the poor. You are punishing the most vulnerable and the least guilty, and you will turn them off the urgently needed climate action agenda. You'll make them hostile to it. And you'll push them into the hands of climate skeptics. So I would appeal to the economists, the ESRI, to distinguish between carbon taxes that punish people who are not in a position to change their behaviour because of price signals, and those who essentially make money from polluting carbon type industries. That's the first thing. So I put that point to you. Secondly, just to ask, I mean, you're saying essentially that some of the inflationary pressures we're seeing at the moment are kind of specific to the COVID situation, to people saving money and then starting to spend it again because things reopen, if I understand correctly, slowdowns in particular sectors where, if you like, demand fell off during COVID. But is there any lessons to be learned about our vulnerability to these kind of inflationary pressures from COVID? I mean, to me, the lesson you've got to learn from it, particularly when you look at energy, but in any other area, is the more you plan and the more you don't depend on if you like, the swings and roundabouts of markets responding in particular ways to particular situations, the more you're able to cope with these kind of situations. So I just, ask you for your opinion on that, because I think you're more vulnerable to these swings or these, moments of inflationary surge if you have areas which are completely dependent on private market actors to determine supply at critical moments, particularly when those supply are of critical things for the sustaining of the economy. Very last question, I do want to give you time to come back, is you said we need to ramp up capital investment in a whole range of areas in order to, and I agree with you, housing, retrofit, public transport, forestry, to discuss another thing that's come up a lot this week. There's a whole range of areas. Third level education, I would say, because if we don't have the skilled workforce to do a lot of the things we need to do, the trained workforce, apprenticeships and all the rest of it, this will create bottlenecks and create inflation. But you were saying that if we're doing that, we've got to be careful about current spending. I mean, are you saying, could you identify where we should then be cutting back on current spending? Because I worry about that. That sounds a little bit like austerity. And shouldn't we at least point to the other possibility rather than cutting back on, because I often even the distinction between current and capital is a bit lost on me in certain areas. Where does increased investment in education, where does capital and current begin and end? I'm not quite sure, to be honest. We need more teachers, we need more school buildings, so maybe you could just sort of comment on that. But it seems to me there is an alternative, which is to look at the distribution of income and wealth in our society and look at tax policies that will actually give us more revenue by redistributing wealth and profits, which we have seen grow very significantly over the COVID period, but which tend to be concentrated amongst small groups at the top of business or at the top of our society. Thanks.
Thanks, Deputy. Maybe just I'll come in there on the, I think the last couple of points you made there, the inflationary pressure specific to COVID, and then vulnerabilities to kind of swings and roundabouts, if you like, in international markets. Maybe even Niall might jump in on that on the energy side, and then I'll deal with the capital expenditure issue, and then maybe we'll all have a go in the absence of our environmental colleagues. We'll talk a little bit about the carbon tax issues that you raised. I mean, earlier on I made the point that the way I look at it at present, there's kind of four different factors that are influencing the inflationary pressures that we're experiencing right now, and some of those are specific to COVID, some of those maybe less so, and some of those are a combination of kind of existing issues that we have in the economy being exacerbated almost by the COVID situation. So, the energy costs are clearly one that are an international phenomenon. The supply chain issues, very much kind of an international post-COVID type of situation. The base effects, the fact that prices were so low last year, there was deflation in some sectors. Clearly, any increase in inflation or any increase in prices this year results in fairly large swings in inflation as a result. Again, that's COVID related. But then the final one, kind of housing issues in particular, I think that's a classic example of the COVID situation compounding difficulties that were already in the market, in terms of the imbalance between supply and demand. The fact that, if anything, COVID seems to have provided almost a stimulus to the demand side of the housing market in terms of the increase in savings that we've seen. The fact there seems to be preliminary evidence to suggest that some of those savings are going to come back into the property market rather than to other areas of consumer expenditure. That's going to stimulate, to a certain extent, the demand side of the market. And then the fact that the supply side of the market was particularly impacted by COVID between the lockdowns and then obviously the sharp increase in costs in certain sectors of the supply side of the market. So those are the kind of the overall, I think, viewpoint that we'd have. Obviously, as I said, some of those more COVID specific, some of them international, and then some of them the interaction between the COVID situation and existing vulnerabilities or weaknesses, if you like, in the domestic economy. Niall, I don't know, do you want to talk about the energy, and then I'll come back then to the capital issue? Deputy.
Sure, yeah. Well, the energy, a lot of our energy in terms of electricity generation and heating is sourced from gas. And so we are, in terms of exposure to international gas prices, it's a function of what the price is and how much gas you use. And at the moment, we use quite an amount. So to reduce that exposure, accelerating renewables and the environmental transition is perhaps the greatest long-term solution there. Any sort of way to sort of shield people from these prices, if we're still dependent on gas, well, we're going to still face this issue. So the renewables transition, that's perhaps the long-term solution there in terms of reducing our exposure to fluctuations in gas prices. One issue as well when it comes to households and carbon taxes, and it's probably something Karina is more familiar with, but perhaps I would suggest thinking about it in terms of the combination of policies in terms of both the carbon tax, but also the compensatory policies in terms of changes to the welfare system that may help vulnerable households that you discuss.
On the capital expenditure point, Deputy, I suppose the broad point is that we agree, and I think we've put forward the case for significant investment in areas like housing, and I think it's clear now that the whole carbon or environmental area is going to require a significant increase in expenditure as well. So clearly, in terms of capital investment, we see big increases, or certainly sizable increases in capital expenditure coming along over the next couple of years. The issue, I suppose, from a macro point of view is that the economy is set to grow quite strongly. I mean, our expectation is we'll grow very strongly this year, next year, and probably the year or so afterwards. So the danger in that context is that you are seeing a significant increase in capital expenditure or expenditure generally at a time when the economy is performing very strongly, then it can lead to overheating pressures. And I think that's the point. I take your point, at times it's a blur of distinction between capital and current, but we certainly aren't calling for any reduction in current expenditure. But I do think what we're talking about is being disciplined in terms of the rate of increases in current expenditure that we see going forward. Areas where we would look at, for instance, and this maybe chimes a little bit what you're saying, certainly I don't think there's much scope for example, any significant reductions in taxation, in terms of personal income tax and areas of that. You may even call for greater taxation as a way of taking the heat out of the economy, for example. So that's, I think, the point in current expenditure. It's that if we do see significant increase in current expenditure on top of significant increases in capital expenditure, the danger is, in the context of a very strongly growing economy, that you will have an overheating problem. And as I said, sometimes our economic cycle isn't quite the same as the European one, and that has implications in terms of monetary policy and the kind of actions of the European authorities to control inflation. It may well be that our inflation situation will be out of whack with what's going on in Europe. That's kind of a byproduct of our membership of the euro area. So I think that's the broader point on that point. On the carbon tax, Karina, I don't know if you want to jump in, but I think it just, again, going back to the point, I suppose we don't have our environmental colleagues with us, but I'm sure if they were here, they would point, as the point we made in relation to Deputy Healy-Rae's comment or questions, that the evidence does seem to suggest that carbon taxes are an important way of changing behaviour. I take your point about the distributional issues. Clearly, if people don't have an alternative, then that's a huge point. But the research does seem to point fairly conclusively that if you want to change behaviour in this area, then carbon taxes is the way in which to do that.